Welcome to this explainer. I am so excited to dive into this with you today. We're tackling something absolutely massive, the architecture of patriarchy. And we're not just skimming the surface. We're going to break down this complex societal structure using two super fascinating frameworks. First, we'll look at some deep dive sociology out of France, and then we're going to weave in some cross-cultural theological research that looks at both Islamic and Christian traditions. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the big, central question we really need to ask right out of the gate. Is patriarchy fundamentally an economic system, or is it a belief system? Well, spoiler alert, the answer we're going to uncover today is that it's actually both. Throughout this explainer, we're going to look at this whole concept through what we can call a two-pillars framework. Basically, one pillar is material, and the other is ideological.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the roots of patriarchy. Then the domestic economy and the religious structures of patriarchy. After that, we'll explore interpreting sacred texts, feminist theological responses, and finally, reimagining gender and society. We're going to seamlessly bridge French sociological texts with comparative Islamic and Christian theology. So let's keep moving.
Number 1. The roots of patriarchy. Now, to really begin our analysis, we have to look back at where this all started. Historically speaking, the rise of the centralizing state has always had a profound, direct impact on women. Scholars like Kuntz and Henderson point this out, noting that if we look all the way back to places like ancient Greece, we see these exact dynamics already in play.
Which brings us to the central metaphor for our explainer today. I want you to imagine patriarchy as this massive building, right? And it's held up by two distinct pillars. Pillar 1 represents the material and economic foundation, so think sociology and labor. Pillar 2 represents the ideological and theological foundation. This is the realm of belief, religion, and culture. If we only look at one of these pillars, we completely miss the bigger picture. We literally need to understand both to see how the whole structure stays standing.
Number 2, the domestic economy. Let's move to that first pillar and see how this builds. To understand the economic foundation, we're going to look really closely at the groundbreaking theories of French sociologist Christine Delphi.
Now, Delphi is a huge name in what's known as materialist feminism, and the absolute core of her argument rests on a concept called the domestic mode of production. Okay, I know that sounds like a super dense academic term, but it's actually incredibly grounded in everyday life. Just think about it. Who usually does the dishes? Who cleans the house? Who raises the kids? Delphi's theory argues that the true economic base of patriarchy is actually the unpaid, totally unrecognized exploitation of women's labor right inside the household.
And this concept of invisible labor brilliantly illustrates a major blind spot in older economic theories. See, traditional Marxist views focused heavily on capitalist class struggles, right? The factory worker versus the wealthy factory owner. But Delphi points out that they completely overlooked the home. They miss this entirely separate domestic mode of production, where men as a class effectively appropriate women's unpaid domestic labor. It's like an entire parallel economy operating completely under the radar.
Which leads us to Delphi's radical critique of essentialism. She famously argued that gender precedes sex. Basically, this means that the social hierarchy and the division of labor actually create the rigid categories of male and female, rather than biology just dictating our social roles from birth. And here's a fun fact. She points out that the word economy literally stems from the ancient Greek word for rule of the house. So saying domestic economy is actually a tautology. It's like saying household. The household is the original economy, and it's built entirely on a specific gendered division of labor.
Number 3, religious structures of patriarchy. Okay, so having established that first material pillar, we are now going to shift our focus. As neutral observers, we need to examine exactly how this economic structure is justified mentally and spiritually, specifically through religious traditions.
Our source material provides a really fascinating comparative analysis of both Christian and Islamic traditions. Historically, within Christianity, male dominance has often been justified through theological concepts like original sin and male headship. Conversely, if we look at historical Islamic contexts, male dominance has frequently been linked to specific legal interpretations of Sharia and the concept of male guardianship. In both traditions, historically speaking, sacred texts have been interpreted in ways that cement male authority, limiting women's roles across social, political, and religious spheres.
Structurally, though, these norms are enforced a bit differently in daily life. In Christianity, patriarchy has historically been highly institutionalized. You see this particularly in church leadership and ecclesiastical authority. In Islam, on the other hand, the source material notes that these patriarchal structures are often deeply reinforced at the community level, particularly through family laws and everyday practices.
Number 4. Interpreting sacred texts. So, to really understand how these structures became so deeply entrenched over centuries, we have to look at the historical scholars and theologians who actively shaped these attitudes.
When we look cross-culturally at the historical figures who solidified these norms, a pretty clear pattern emerges. Over in the Christian tradition, monumental figures like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, and Martin Luther all contributed heavily to the theology of subordination. They actively excluded women from church leadership and reinforced their primary role as being domestic. Then, in the Islamic tradition, highly influential scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Ghazali played very similar historical roles. They reinforced patriarchal interpretations of Islamic law and strongly emphasized male authority over women.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how these historical figures leaned on very specific sacred texts to justify this exclusion. In the Bible, verses like Genesis 3:16 regarding subordination after the fall, or Paul's letters in Timothy instructing women to learn in silence, have been pivotal. Similarly, in the Quran, verses like 4:34 have historically been interpreted to grant men authority, while verses in chapters 24 and 33 have been utilized to mandate strict gender segregation and modesty.
Number 5. Feminist theological responses. But listen, the story absolutely does not end there. We are currently seeing some incredible dynamic pushback. Let's look at the active reconstruction happening right now in modern feminist theology across both of these faiths. Brilliant feminist thinkers are actively responding by reinterpreting those exact same sacred texts we just talked about. In Christianity, scholars like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza advocate for a rereading that actually highlights the prominent leadership roles women held in early, pre-institutionalized Christianity. And similarly, Islamic scholars like Ozma Barlas are advocating for a deeper, egalitarian understanding of Islam, directly arguing against centuries of patriarchal framing.
The core mission of this feminist theology is all about reclaiming faith. These scholars firmly believe that their religions inherently promote equality, justice, and empowerment, provided they are understood beyond the patriarchal frameworks that have been layered over them for centuries. Basically, they are finding liberative, egalitarian elements within the very texts that were historically used to subordinate them. It's a total paradigm shift.
Number 6. Reimagining gender and society. All right, we've looked at the material pillar and we've explored the ideological pillar. Now let's focus on the future. How do scholars say we can actively dismantle both of these pillars to reimagine our world?
So, the crucial point is that understanding the theory has to lead to action. To move forward, our sources recommend a massive, multi-layered approach. It starts with education, reforming religious studies and promoting gender-sensitive interpretations. Then it moves to the community level, encouraging interfaith collaboration and demanding that religious institutions critically reevaluate their exclusionary practices. And finally, it requires broader systemic action. We're talking about launching awareness campaigns, pushing for public policy changes, and using intersectional approaches that recognize exactly how race, class, and gender all lock together.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought. We've seen how patriarchy requires both the unpaid labor of the home and the ideological reinforcement of faith to stand tall. So, if we successfully dismantle both the economic and ideological pillars of the system, what kind of society will we build in their place? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. I hope this deep dive leaves you eager to explore these fascinating academic theories even further.